In the spring of 1940, in a quiet corner of southern Poland, a man arrived at a former military barracks that the Nazis had begun turning into a prison camp. His name was Rudolf Höss. At that moment, very few people in the world had heard his name. Within a few years, he would become the administrator of one of the deadliest killing centers in human history. Höss was not a famous general or a charismatic leader. He was something far more dangerous, a disciplined bureaucrat who believed completely in obedience and efficiency. Born in Germany in 1901, he grew up in a strict Catholic family where duty and discipline were everything. His father wanted him to become a priest, but the chaos of the early 20th century pulled him in a different direction. As a teenager during World War I, he served as one of the youngest soldiers in the German army. War hardened him early, violence became normal, and loyalty to authority became absolute. After the war, Germany was unstable and humiliated. Like many young men searching for purpose, Höss drifted toward radical nationalist movements. In the 1920s, he joined the Nazi Party and eventually the SS, the elite organization that would become the backbone of Adolf Hitler's regime. The SS valued discipline above all else, and Höss fit perfectly into that world. He followed orders without hesitation and rarely questioned the morality of what he was asked to do. Before long, he was working in Germany's growing system of concentration camps. At places like Dachau and Sachsenhausen, he learned the methods of intimidation, surveillance, and control that would define the Nazi camp system. The camps were brutal even then, but their purpose was still primarily imprisonment and forced labor. That would soon change. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the regime suddenly controlled millions of people it considered enemies or racially inferior. The SS leadership needed someone to build and manage a new camp in occupied Poland. In 1940, Höss was selected for the job. The location was a small Polish town called Oświęcim. The Germans renamed it Auschwitz. There, surrounded by forests and railway lines, Höss began constructing what would become the vast complex known as Auschwitz concentration camp. At first, Auschwitz looked like many other camps. Prisoners, mostly Polish political prisoners, were forced to work under brutal conditions. Guards ruled through fear. Punishments were harsh and often deadly. But in the offices of the Nazi leadership, plans were evolving that would transform Auschwitz into something far more sinister. In 1941 and 1942, the Nazi regime began implementing what they called the Final Solution, a coordinated plan to systematically murder Europe's Jewish population. Auschwitz, under the command of Höss, would become one of the central locations where this plan was carried out. Höss later wrote that he received orders directly from senior SS leaders to expand the camp and create facilities capable of killing thousands of people every day. Instead of questioning the orders, he approached the task like an engineer solving a logistical problem. Railway tracks were extended directly into the camp. New sections were constructed, including the massive complex known as Auschwitz-Birkenau. Prisoners arriving by train were forced onto platforms where SS officers decided their fate within seconds. Those considered strong enough to work were sent into forced labor. The rest, often the elderly, the sick, and children, were sent toward buildings disguised as showers. Inside those buildings were gas chambers. Höss supervised the development of a system that used a pesticide called Zyklon B to kill large groups of people quickly. The process was horrifyingly methodical. Victims were forced into sealed chambers. The chemical pellets were dropped inside. Within minutes, thousands could be dead. For Höss, this was not chaos, it was organization. He later described his role as managing transportation schedules, construction projects, and the efficiency of the killing process. At its peak, Auschwitz could murder several thousand people in a single day. Crematoria were built to dispose of the bodies. Prisoners were forced to handle the grim work of removing corpses, cutting hair, and sorting through belongings. Suitcases, shoes, glasses, and even children's toys piled up in enormous warehouses. Over time, Auschwitz became the largest and most efficient killing center the Nazis created. Historians estimate that more than 1 million people were murdered there, the vast majority of them Jews. Others included Roma, Polish prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and countless civilians deemed enemies of the regime. And at the center of this vast machine stood Rudolf Höss. Those who met him often described him as calm, polite, even ordinary. He lived with his wife and children in a comfortable house just outside the camp walls. From his garden, he could see the chimneys of the crematoria. Smoke often drifted across the sky. Years later, one of his own children would remember growing up in what seemed like a peaceful countryside home, unaware of the horror unfolding only meters away. But prisoners inside the camp knew exactly who Höss was. To them, he represented the ultimate authority over life and death. His policies shaped every aspect of daily existence in Auschwitz: how prisoners were punished, how they were worked, and how they were killed. Some survivors later recalled seeing him ride through the camp on horseback, inspecting operations with cold detachment. Others remembered the constant fear his orders created. Among prisoners and guards alike, his reputation grew darker with time. Many began to refer to him as the animal of Auschwitz. Yet the most disturbing part of the story is that Höss did not see himself as a monster. In his own writings after the war, he claimed he was simply carrying out the orders of the Nazi state. He insisted that obedience was his duty, and that the system demanded efficiency. But behind those claims stood the undeniable reality of Auschwitz itself, a place where industrial organization was used to carry out mass murder on an unimaginable scale. By 1944, trains were arriving at Auschwitz from across occupied Europe, Hungary, France, the Netherlands, Greece, and beyond. The killing operation ran almost constantly. Smoke rose from the crematoria day and night, and the man overseeing it all, the quiet administrator in the house beside the camp, continued to manage the machinery of death with chilling precision. For a time, it seemed like he might never be held accountable. But as the war began to turn against Nazi Germany, the vast system Höss had helped build would begin to collapse. The front lines were moving closer, and the leaders of the Third Reich knew that their crimes were slowly being uncovered. Soon, the man who had organized one of history's greatest atrocities would disappear into the chaos of a defeated empire. And the hunt for him had not even begun. In the final months of World War II, the powerful machine of Nazi Germany began to collapse faster than anyone inside the regime had expected. For years, Nazi leaders had spoken confidently about building a 1,000-year Reich. Instead, by early 1945, their empire was crumbling on every front. From the east, the massive forces of the Red Army were pushing steadily into German-occupied territory. From the west, British and American troops were advancing through France and into Germany itself. Cities were being bombed daily, railways were shattered, and millions of soldiers were retreating in chaos. For the Nazi leadership, defeat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a reality. Inside Auschwitz concentration camp, the situation was becoming desperate. For years, the camp had operated as one of the largest centers of imprisonment, forced labor, and mass murder in Nazi-occupied Europe. Trains had arrived from across the continent, carrying men, women, and children who were immediately forced into the brutal machinery of the camp system. But now, the front lines were getting closer. By late 1944, Soviet forces were advancing rapidly through Poland. The SS leadership understood exactly what this meant. If the Red Army captured Auschwitz intact, the world would discover the full scale of what had happened there. Orders soon arrived from high-ranking Nazi officials: destroy the evidence. Camp administrators were instructed to burn documents, dismantle equipment, and erase as many traces of the extermination system as possible. Prisoners were forced to work day and night, destroying records and dismantling parts of the camp. But the truth was impossible to hide completely. The complex at Auschwitz had grown far too large. Warehouses were still filled with mountains of belongings taken from prisoners: suitcases, clothing, shoes, glasses, even children's toys. Gas chambers and crematoria had been built across the camp. Railway tracks led directly into the complex, where trains had delivered victims from across Europe. No matter how much the SS tried to destroy, the scale of the crime could not simply disappear. As Soviet forces moved closer in January 1945, the SS began evacuating the camp. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced out of Auschwitz and marched westward through freezing winter conditions. These evacuations would later become known as the Death Marches. Prisoners who had already endured years of starvation and brutal labor were suddenly pushed onto icy roads with almost no food or shelter. Many were too weak to walk. Those who collapsed or fell behind were often shot by guards. The marches stretched for miles through the snow-covered countryside. For the prisoners, it was another nightmare added to years of suffering. Meanwhile, the SS leadership and camp officials were abandoning the area. Some attempted to destroy more evidence. Others simply fled as the Soviet army approached. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Red Army entered the grounds of Auschwitz. What they found stunned even experienced soldiers who had already witnessed years of brutal warfare. Thousands of prisoners remained alive inside the camp, though many were starving and gravely ill. Barracks were filled with people barely able to stand. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was the evidence left behind. Entire warehouses were filled with the belongings of victims: piles of shoes, mountains of clothing, suitcases labeled with names and addresses. These objects told a silent story of the people who had once owned them, people who had arrived at Auschwitz but never left. For the first time, the world began to understand the scale of what had happened there. Photographs and reports from the camp spread quickly through Allied governments and newspapers. The name Auschwitz soon became a symbol of the horrors of the Holocaust. But one of the most important men responsible for the camp was already gone. Months before the Soviet army arrived, the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, had disappeared into the collapsing structure of Nazi Germany. Like many senior SS officers, he understood that the end of the war would bring consequences. The evidence of what had happened at Auschwitz was too enormous to hide forever. If captured, he would almost certainly face trial for war crimes. So he made a decision. He vanished. Instead of trying to flee far away or cross international borders, Höss chose a different strategy, one that many former Nazis believed would protect them. He changed his identity and attempted to blend in to the massive population of displaced people moving across Germany after the war. He took a new name, Franz Lang. Under this identity, the former commandant transformed himself into something almost invisible. He grew a beard, changed his appearance, and began living the life of a simple laborer. Eventually, he found work on a quiet farm in northern Germany, not far from the Danish border. The countryside there was calm and isolated compared to the destruction seen in the cities. Fields stretched for miles, small villages dotted the landscape, and farm workers were in high demand to help rebuild the agricultural economy. For someone trying to disappear, it was the perfect hiding place. Day after day, the man once responsible for overseeing Auschwitz now carried out ordinary tasks. He worked with livestock, repaired fences, and slept in simple farm buildings alongside other laborers. To the people around him, Franz Lang seemed like just another tired German worker trying to survive after the war. No one looking at him in the fields would have guessed that he had once commanded thousands of SS guards and supervised one of the most deadly extermination systems in human history. For months, his plan worked. Across Europe, Allied investigators were searching for Nazi officials who had escaped justice. Some were already captured. Others were preparing to stand trial in the famous proceedings that would soon begin in the German city of Nuremberg. But Rudolf Höss remained missing. Investigators knew his name and understood his importance. As the former commandant of Auschwitz, he possessed detailed knowledge about how the extermination camps had been organized and operated. Yet despite months of searching, there was no clear trace of him. Some believed he had fled the country, others thought he might have died during the chaos of the war's final battles. But the truth was far simpler and far more disturbing. The man responsible for organizing the machinery of death at Auschwitz was not hiding in some distant country. He was living quietly in rural Germany, working as a farm laborer, hoping the world would forget who he was. But the search for Nazi war criminals was only beginning. And somewhere among the Allied investigators determined to bring those criminals to justice was a man who would soon begin closing in on the fugitive commandant. His name was Hans Alexander, and before long he would uncover the clue that would lead directly to the quiet farm where Franz Lang was hiding. In the months after the end of World War II, Europe was a continent filled with ruins, refugees, and unanswered questions. Entire cities had been destroyed, governments were being rebuilt, and millions of people were trying to start their lives again. But among the chaos, another mission had begun quietly in the background. The Allied powers were hunting the architects of Nazi crimes. Some of the most powerful figures of the regime had already been captured and were standing trial in the historic Nuremberg trials. Yet many others had vanished into the shattered landscape of post-war Germany. SS officers, camp guards, and administrators who had once ruled with absolute power were now hiding behind false identities. Among the most wanted of them all was the former commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss. Investigators knew that capturing Höss was crucial. He was not just another officer in the Nazi system. He had overseen the largest killing complex created by the regime. His testimony could reveal how the extermination program had been organized and who had given the orders. But there was one problem. He had disappeared without a trace. Months passed with no confirmed sightings. Rumors surfaced from time to time. Someone claimed they had seen him in Bavaria. Another insisted he had fled to Austria. Some investigators even believed he might have escaped Germany entirely. The search could easily have gone cold, but in the British occupation zone, a special group of investigators refused to give up. Their job was to track down high-ranking SS officers who believed they could simply melt back into civilian life. One of the officers leading that effort was a young captain named Hans Alexander. Alexander's story was unusual. Born in Germany to a Jewish family, he had been forced to flee the country after the Nazis rose to power. His family escaped to Britain, where he eventually joined the British Army. Now, wearing the uniform of the nation that had given him refuge, he was hunting the men responsible for the regime that had persecuted his people. For Alexander, this mission was more than just military duty, it was personal. He had already helped capture several Nazi officials, but Rudolf Höss remained one of the most elusive targets. Every investigator knew the name. Every file described the same horrifying reality. The man who had organized the mass murder at Auschwitz concentration camp was still free somewhere in Germany. Alexander and his team began searching for leads the old-fashioned way. They studied captured documents, they interviewed former SS officers, they interrogated camp personnel who had been arrested after the war. Piece by piece, they tried to map out the networks of friendships and family connections that might reveal where Höss had gone. Again and again, the same conclusion appeared. If Höss was alive, he was probably hiding under a false identity. That was a common strategy among former SS officers. Many had burned their uniforms, changed their names, and taken simple jobs in rural areas where strangers were less likely to attract attention. Germany in 1945 was full of displaced people and wandering laborers. A man could disappear if he was careful. But Alexander believed something important. Even the most careful fugitives make mistakes. Eventually, the investigation turned toward Höss's family. His wife and children had survived the war, and like many families connected to the SS, they were now living quietly under Allied supervision. Investigators suspected that if Höss was still alive, he might have contacted them, or at least tried to protect them. Alexander ordered the interrogation of Höss's wife. At first, she refused to cooperate. She claimed she had no idea where her husband was. According to her story, they had been separated during the chaos of the war, and she had not heard from him since. But the investigators were not convinced. They had already learned that many Nazi fugitives stayed secretly connected to their families. Letters were passed through trusted friends. Messages were delivered by former comrades. Sometimes money appeared mysteriously to support wives and children. Alexander decided to apply pressure. During questioning, he made it clear that hiding information about a wanted war criminal could have serious consequences. The investigators also reminded her that Rudolf Höss was accused of overseeing the murder of more than 1 million people. The tension in the room grew heavier with every passing minute. Finally, the story began to crack. Höss's wife admitted something important. Her husband had not disappeared completely. He had contacted her after the war. He was alive, and he was hiding somewhere in northern Germany. For Alexander, it was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. But there was still a problem. She refused to reveal the exact location. Alexander knew he needed something more, some kind of leverage strong enough to force the truth out. Without it, Höss might remain hidden for years. So the investigators searched the family home carefully. Documents were examined, personal items were inspected, even small details that seemed insignificant were considered potential clues. Somewhere in that house, Alexander believed there might be a piece of evidence pointing to the fugitive commandant's hiding place. Then they found something interesting. Among the personal belongings was a wedding ring that once belonged to Rudolf Höss. Engraved on the inside were the names of Höss and his wife, along with the date of their marriage. Alexander suddenly realized the importance of that ring. If Höss was truly living under a false identity, he might still carry it as proof of who he really was. It could be the one object that connected the mysterious farm laborer Franz Lang to the former commandant of Auschwitz. And that meant something else. If they could find the man wearing that ring, they would find Rudolf Höss. Under increasing pressure, Höss's wife finally revealed what the investigators needed most: the name of the farm where he was hiding. It was located in the country near the Danish border. There, she said, her husband was living under a new identity and working as a simple laborer. To the outside world, he was just another anonymous farm worker in post-war Germany. But to the investigators preparing to move in, he was the most wanted man in Europe. Captain Hans Alexander immediately began organizing a small team of British soldiers. The mission would have to be carried out quickly and quietly. If Höss suspected anything, he could disappear again into the countryside. The plan was simple. They would arrive at the farm in the middle of the night. They would search every building, and if the information was correct, somewhere in the darkness of that rural property, they would find the man who once commanded Auschwitz. Within hours, the soldiers were on the road, heading toward a lonely farm surrounded by fields and barns. Inside one of those barns, a man calling himself Franz Lang was sleeping, unaware that the hunters were already closing in. By the time the sun rose, one of the most notorious fugitives of the Second World War would finally come face to face with the men who had been searching for him. The road to the farm was dark and silent. It was the night of March 11th, 1946, and a small group of British soldiers moved carefully through the countryside of northern Germany. Their vehicle stopped at a distance so the sound of engines would not alert anyone nearby. From there, the men continued on foot. Leading them was Hans Alexander. For weeks he had been chasing fragments of information, rumors, interrogations, and small clues that slowly pointed toward this quiet rural property near the Danish border. Now everything depended on whether the final lead was correct. Somewhere on this farm, they believed, was the man who had once commanded the largest killing center in Nazi-occupied Europe, Rudolf Höss. The soldiers spread out as they approached the buildings. The farm looked ordinary: a house, several barns, and open fields stretching into darkness. There was nothing about the place that suggested one of the most wanted war criminals in the world might be hiding there. That was exactly why it worked. Post-war Germany was filled with farms like this. Displaced laborers and refugees worked long hours in the fields, trying to rebuild their lives after the collapse of Nazi Germany. A quiet farm worker rarely attracted attention. Alexander signaled his men to move in. The team surrounded the buildings before knocking on the farmhouse door. When the farmer opened it, British soldiers were already standing in the doorway. They entered quickly, identifying themselves and ordering everyone inside to remain calm. The farmer appeared confused but cooperative. He insisted that there was nothing unusual about his workers. They were simply laborers trying to survive after the war. Alexander listened carefully, studying the man's face. Then he asked a simple question. "Who is Franz Lang?" The farmer pointed toward the barn. According to him, Lang was just another worker, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself. He slept in the barn with the other laborers and spent his days tending animals and repairing fences. To the farmer, there was nothing remarkable about him, but Alexander's instincts told him otherwise. The soldiers moved toward the barn with flashlights and weapons ready. The door creaked open, revealing the dim interior. Several men were sleeping on rough beds of straw and blankets. The sudden light woke them instantly. One by one, the soldiers ordered them to stand up and identify themselves. The workers looked confused and frightened. They were thin, exhausted men who likely spent months struggling to survive in the ruins of post-war Germany. Most of them cooperated immediately, giving their names and answering questions. Then Alexander's attention settled on one man. He was tall, thin, and bearded. His clothes were simple and worn like the others. When asked his name, he calmly replied that he was Franz Lang, a farm laborer. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual, but Alexander had studied the face of Rudolf Höss many times in photographs. Even with the beard and rough appearance, there was something familiar about the man standing in front of him. Still, the fugitive remained calm. He repeated his story. He was just a gardener and farm worker. He had never been involved in politics or the military. Like millions of others, he claimed to be another victim of the chaos that followed the war. The story sounded rehearsed. Alexander stepped closer. He looked directly into his eyes and spoke quietly. "If you are not Rudolf Höss, then you have nothing to fear." The man said nothing. For several seconds, the barn was silent except for the sound of wind outside. Alexander knew he needed proof. Then he remembered the clue that had brought them here, the small detail discovered during the investigation of Höss's family, the wedding ring. He ordered the man to show his hands. At first, the farm worker hesitated, but surrounded by armed soldiers, he slowly raised them. On one of his fingers was a ring. Alexander removed it and turned it toward the light. Inside the band was an engraving. 2 names, Rudolf and Hedwig, along with the date of their marriage. For a moment, the room was completely still. The quiet farm worker who called himself Franz Lang had no explanation left. The disguise was over. The soldiers had found the former commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp. Alexander looked directly at him. "You are Rudolf Höss." He finally understood that the hunt was over. At first, he still tried to deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. The ring connected him to his real identity, and the investigators already knew too much about his past. Within minutes, the British soldiers placed him under arrest. One of the most notorious fugitives of the Second World War had been hiding in a barn, pretending to be a simple farm worker. Now he was in chains. As the soldiers led him outside, the cold night air cut across the farmyard. The same fields that had hidden him for months were now filled with British troops and flashing lights. The man who oversaw the mass murder of more than 1 million people was finally captured. But the story was far from over. Because once Rudolf Höss was in custody, the investigators planned to do something even more important than simply arrest him. They were going to make him talk. And what he would reveal about Auschwitz and the machinery of the Holocaust would shock the world.
The capture of Rudolf Höss marked the end of one of the most important manhunts of the post-war period. For months, he had lived quietly under the false identity of Franz Lang, working as a farm laborer and hoping the chaos after World War II would allow him to disappear forever. But on that cold night in March 1946, his past finally caught up with him. Once the British soldiers secured him, they transported him away from the farm under heavy guard. The man who had once commanded thousands of SS guards and controlled the fate of millions of prisoners now sat silently in the back of a military vehicle, guarded by the same soldiers he once would have considered enemies. Leading the investigation was Hans Alexander, the officer who had spent weeks tracking him down. Alexander understood that the arrest was only the beginning. Capturing Höss was important, but what truly mattered now was the information he carried. For years, the world had only fragments of the truth about the Nazi extermination camps. Survivors had told horrifying stories. Soldiers had discovered camps filled with evidence of mass murder. But the full structure of the killing system, the planning, the orders, and the organization behind it was still being uncovered. Rudolf Höss knew those details better than almost anyone. During interrogation, investigators began asking him about his role in the camp he had commanded. At first, Höss appeared calm and detached. He answered questions in a methodical tone, often speaking about the camp's operations as if you were describing a factory or a logistics center. But what he described shocked even the experienced investigators in the room. Höss openly admitted that under his command, the extermination system at Auschwitz concentration camp had reached an industrial scale. He explained how trains arrived from across occupied Europe carrying Jewish families, political prisoners, and others targeted by the Nazi regime. When the trains arrived, selections took place on the platforms. Prisoners who were strong enough to work were sent into forced labor. The rest, often the elderly, women with children, and the sick, were sent directly toward the gas chambers. Höss described the process with disturbing precision. He explained how Zyklon B, a pesticide, was used in the gas chambers to kill large groups of people within minutes. He spoke about how the crematoria were designed to dispose of the bodies quickly so that the killing process could continue without interruption. At times, thousands of people were murdered in a single day. For investigators, these confessions were crucial. They confirmed what survivors had been saying for months and provided detailed insight into how the Nazi extermination program functioned. Eventually, Höss was brought as a witness to testify during the proceedings connected to the Nuremberg trials. In those courtrooms where some of the most powerful leaders of Nazi Germany were being judged, his testimony helped reveal the horrifying efficiency of the Holocaust. For the first time, the world heard directly from the man who had managed Auschwitz. But Höss himself would not be judged in Germany. After the investigations were complete, the Allies made the decision to transfer him to Poland. The crimes committed at Auschwitz had taken place on Polish soil, and the Polish government intended to put him on trial there. In 1947, Höss stood before a Polish court accused of crimes against humanity. Survivors of Auschwitz attended the trial, many of them seeing the man responsible for the camp's operations for the first time. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses described the brutality of the camp system. Documents revealed the scale of the extermination program, and Höss himself had already admitted his role in building and managing that system. The court found him guilty. His sentence was death. But there was one final detail that made the judgment especially symbolic. The Polish authorities decided that the execution would take place at the very location where his crimes had been committed, back at Auschwitz. Not far from the former commandant's house, where he had once lived comfortably with his family while the camp operated beside him, a gallows was constructed. On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was led to that gallows. The same camp where more than 1 million people had been murdered under his command would now become the place where his life ended. Within the walls of Auschwitz concentration camp, the man who once controlled the machinery of death was finally brought to justice. His execution did not erase the suffering that had taken place there. The victims of Auschwitz and the Holocaust could never be brought back. Entire families had been destroyed, communities erased, and lives stolen on an unimaginable scale. But the capture and trial of Rudolf Höss sent a powerful message to the world. Even in the chaos that followed the war, even when criminals tried to hide behind false names and quiet lives, justice could still find them. The quiet barn where he was discovered, the wedding ring that revealed his identity, and the relentless investigation that led to his arrest all became part of one of the most remarkable manhunts of the 20th century. A man who believed he could disappear into history was finally forced to face it. And through his capture, the world gained a clearer understanding of the crimes committed during the Holocaust, ensuring that the memory of those victims would never be forgotten.